So how do you deal with dissent if dissent has this logic? And by the way, every single democracy, right, faces this problem. You can't just deal with it within the simple logic of disagreement, right? I mean, that's easy. I can just choose to ignore you. You can say whatever you want, so long as you're not being able to persuade other people, that's perfectly fine, right? Okay. So when faced with genuine dissent, in a sense, this prospect of a withdrawal of consent, or this puncturing of the myth of consent, this puncturing of the legitimacy that the state is claiming in respect to that matter, the state's option that becomes is you want to deny those who are dissenting this way their standing. You want to say that their seeming performance or threat of a withdrawal of consent, they're enacting a refusal to recognize the legitimacy of a law, does not count because they are violating some basic civic obligations. And the only way in which you can do this is by de facto criminalizing them. The attack on dissent is not so much an attack on those particular ideas. Often it is. The government just doesn't like those ideas, right? But what makes the attack on the dissenters, right, why you need to criminalize them, is you have to, in a sense, deny them standing as citizens, right? Because only by denying them that can you say, look, that our myth of consent has not been punctured or questioned. Now, this rather obvious truth, that the crushing of dissent in a democracy, the crushing of that refusal, right, is about preserving the legitimacy in the myth of consent, explains two things. One, it explains the logic of laws that actually regulate dissent and convert dissent into criminal crimes, right? Think of all the laws through which dissent is criminalized, right? Sedition, terrorism, public order provisions, regulation of public protest, the ban on strikes, right? In a sense, the regulation on speech that expresses contempt of court sometimes. What is the common thread in all of these laws? In sedition and suspicion of terrorism charges, the claim is express that these are groups that are withdrawing their consent from the state, and that is manifest in the fact that they are committed to the violent overthrow of the state, right? And of course, there are sometimes groups like that. Let's not underplay that fact. But the criminalization, the process of criminalization of dissent, is the idea that more and more groups should be treated not just as expressing a different opinion, but as different ways of withholding consent. This is exactly the strategy that is being, for example, deployed in two of the major protests of our times. The targeting of CA protesters. Why are they being tried against under UAPA, which is a law expressly designed for those whom you don't want to give standing as reasonable citizens. The four tropes that are used in a sense, criminalizing these protests, whether it's the Delhi riot cases, the Bhima Koregaon cases. The first will be the government's claim. You know, this protest seems to be public, right? Remember, civil disobedience always used to say that always carry out your act publicly, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to justify your acts at the tribunal of public justification, right? That's the Gandhian logic of public satyagraha. But the government will almost always want to show that these acts actually have a secret conspiracy behind them. Okay? By the way, every single democratic government employs the same logic. I mean, one of the striking things, if you look at, for example, the recently released FBI files on the Occupy Wall Street protests, it's exactly the same logic. They seem to be carrying it out in public. They seem to abide by the Constitution. In India's case, they seem to be carrying pictures of Gandhi and Ambedkar and are enacting the grammar of higher constitutionalism. But at the heart of this protest is a secret conspiracy. Right? The public avowal of constitutional values masks the fact that they're secret conspirators. Who tells us that? A secret intelligence service like the FBI, right? Or the CBI or something like that. Second, notice in delegitimizing these protesters, the attention is shifted from the particular moral claim they are making. Is the CAA discriminatory? Should bankers in the United States be prosecuted for malfeasance, fraud? Right? We can disagree about these claims. Is the NRC justified? The attention is being shifted from the moral claim to the standing of the protesters. They must be Maoists. They must be jihadists. This is a leftist, Maoist, liberal, jihadist conspiracy. Right? The non-violence was a facade. Underlying it is a will to anarchy, no higher rule here, but a propensity to lawlessness. Okay? Again, remember, they are forced into this logic. Because the only way they can conceptualize the dissenter is through that act of refusal. It's not about the substantive moral claim they're arguing. Can we give more evidence for this fact? It's often buttressed by the fact that the state will construct the dissenter as a self-chosen vanguard. As the state says, there are professional dissenters who show up everywhere. They're dissenters in this negative sense. Think of another example, right? So it's dissent in the specific sense that you want to construct this group as carrying out that act of refusal, which punctures that myth of consent. This same phenomenon about the refusal of consent shows up in another place, the right to strike. Right? This is a very controversial right in many constitutional jurisdictions. But it is fair to say that this is a right that has been significantly eroded in all democratic jurisdictions over the last couple of decades. In part because the balance of power between labor and capital has shifted as manufacturing declined. And India's new labor laws completely shift this power, right, in favor of capital. I mean, those laws might as well be meaningless for the most part, at least the operative ones that deal with the balance of power between the two. Our new labor laws are designed to accelerate this trend by making strikes almost impossible. The ratio of strikes to lockout has long been tilted in favor of lockouts. Unions have generally been weakening in India. There was a lot of support for these kinds of anti-labor dissent measures, particularly those who lived in Mumbai and Kolkata have long memories of labor unrest issues in the 1970s. And to be fair, often that kind of labor unrest did have serious consequences. The scholars who have calculated that Bengal probably lost 1/10 of its GDP in a decade due to those hartals and strikes. But at the core of diminishing the right to strike is not this empirical fact, which is often invoked, right? I mean, that's a judgment call you can make. It is the fear. What does the strike do? It explodes the myth of consent. The legitimacy of, in a sense, the labor contract is founded on the claim that it is a contract made freely and with some reciprocal obligations, right? Both for the employer and the employee. The right to strike in its core is not just about, right, maintaining the relative bargaining power between labor and capital. It is in a sense also underwriting the myth of free consent in labor relations. And the big change in global attitudes to strikes has been about what does a strike demonstrate? It punctures the myth, rather, that a employee-employee relationship is a free and reciprocal relationship. The fact that you need a strike, that fact itself is the objectionable fact, not the moral substance of the claims that might be advanced. Right? So in a variety of ways, it is actually the logic of democracy and consent that pushes the state to dilute the distinction between political dissent and criminal activity. And this is really the one large point I want to make, that when we're thinking about dissent, we often think of the traditional model of dissent, right? The language of repression. There is a state, there are individuals have rights, the state is repressing those rights, it is taking those rights away. And of course, that's exactly right in some respects, right? The state is, when it's arresting people arbitrarily for protesting, when it is curtailing the freedom of expression, when it is making the right to strike completely meaningless, right? It is, in some senses, engaging in repression in particular ways. This is the familiar sense in which we also, for example, think of the continuity of state forms. If you read H.W. Hale's Terrorism in India, an account of the colonial state's construction of terrorism at the turn of the century, or James Kerr, who worked in British intelligence under the Raj and compiled reports on political troubles in India, many of their modus operandi look exactly identical to what the Indian state is doing in the Delhi riots, in the anti-CAA cases, or in the Bhima Koregaon cases. Intelligence evidence tells you there are secret political groupings. The thing you want to do is impugn the standing of the protester. You don't want to, in a sense, engage with the substance of the moral claims. But this continuity, right, that this is about state repression, should not blind us to what is more problematic about criminalizing dissent in modern democracies. It is the fact that the language of consent and democracy is also being mobilized in blurring this line. The claim is being made not so much that it is a state repressing citizens without rights, as in a colonial state, but it is a democracy, right, that is denying standing to those who want to claim democratic citizenship. The democratic imprimatur behind blurring the lines between the criminal and the dissenter is also as serious, right, as the imprimatur of the state. And that is what makes it combating harder. The charge is made is that the dissenter is subverting democracy, not the state. And he or she has to be represented as such, right? So that's why, in a sense, this criminalization of dissent in its work has a pattern. These are not people who are part of democratic discourse. They don't believe in it. That's the only way in which you can respond to dissent, right? Right? They're Khalistani, they're jihadi, they're something like that. But what I'm suggesting to you, that the uncomfortable thought is that you are pushed into this by the founding myth of consent, democratic legitimacy as the basis of the state. Of course, there are lots of other things that have also facilitated this dilution between dissent and criminality. The expansion of terrorism-related discourses in law is a very important facet of that. The crucial claim in laws relating to terrorism, right? UAPA, TADA, POTA. And by the way, again, this is true of all jurisdictions in the world, whether it's United States, Canada, United Kingdom.